Most people believe their thoughts are reactions. They assume that what they think is simply a response to what is happening around them. A situation appears, and a thought follows. A challenge arises, and a conclusion is formed. It feels immediate. It feels natural. It feels like the mind is responding in real time. But if you observe closely, something different begins to emerge. Thoughts are not as random as they appear. They follow patterns. These patterns are not always obvious. They operate quietly beneath the surface. But they influence everything. The same types of thoughts appear in different situations. The same conclusions are reached even when circumstances change. The same expectations return, regardless of new possibilities. This is because the mind is not simply reacting. It is repeating. It is drawing from a structure that has been built over time, a structure formed through experience, repetition, and reinforcement. Every time a thought is followed without question, it strengthens that structure. Every time a conclusion is accepted, it becomes more familiar. And what is familiar becomes automatic. This is how patterns form, not through intention, but through repetition. At first, a thought may feel uncertain. It may be questioned. It may even be challenged. But if it is repeated enough times, it begins to feel stable. It begins to feel reliable. And eventually, it begins to feel true. This is where the pattern becomes difficult to recognize, because it no longer feels like a pattern. It feels like reality. A person who has repeatedly experienced thoughts of doubt begins to expect doubt. A person who has repeatedly experienced thoughts of hesitation begins to expect hesitation. These expectations shape perception. They influence what is noticed and what is ignored. They influence what is believed to be possible and what is dismissed. And over time, they begin to define behavior. A person does not simply think a thought. They act in alignment with it. They avoid what feels uncertain. They move toward what feels familiar. And in doing so, they reinforce the pattern. The same thoughts lead to the same actions. The same actions lead to the same results. And those results reinforce the same thoughts again. This cycle continues quietly, unnoticed, unquestioned, until it becomes a way of life. But once you begin to observe this process, something changes. You begin to see that your thinking is not random. It is structured. It is patterned. And once you see the pattern, you begin to understand its influence, not as something fixed, but as something learned. And anything learned can be changed. But before it can be changed, it must be recognized. You must begin to see the pattern beneath your thinking. As you begin to recognize these patterns, a deeper question naturally arises. Where did they come from? Because once you see that your thoughts repeat, you begin to realize they did not start in the moment you are experiencing. They were formed earlier, often long before you became aware of them. Some were formed through direct experience, moments where something happened and the mind created a conclusion. Other patterns were formed indirectly, through observation, through what you heard, through what you were told, through what was repeated around you. These patterns were absorbed, not chosen. And because they were absorbed gradually, they were rarely questioned. They became part of the background, part of how you interpret the world. This is why certain thoughts feel immediate. They do not need to be constructed. They are already there, waiting, ready to appear when triggered. A situation arises, and the pattern activates. A thought appears that feels familiar, and because it feels familiar, it feels correct. But familiarity is not proof. It is repetition. This is an important distinction, because once you understand that familiarity comes from repetition, you begin to question its authority. You begin to see that a thought can feel true without being accurate, and that realization creates space. A space between what appears and what is accepted. Within that space, something becomes possible. You begin to examine the thought. You begin to ask whether it is still valid, whether it applies to the present moment, or whether it is simply a repetition of the past. This questioning interrupts the pattern, and when a pattern is interrupted, it begins to weaken. Because patterns depend on consistency, they depend on being followed, and when they are no longer followed automatically, they lose strength. At the same time, something new begins to form, a different way of responding, a different way of thinking, a different pattern. But this new pattern does not form instantly. It requires repetition as well. It requires awareness. It requires consistency. Each time you choose not to follow an old thought, you weaken it. Each time you choose a different response, you strengthen something new. And over time, these choices begin to shift the structure beneath your thinking, not dramatically at first, but steadily. And that steady shift begins to change everything that follows. As you continue to observe your thinking, another pattern begins to emerge. Not just what you think, but how quickly you believe it. There is often no pause. A thought appears, and it is accepted almost instantly. There is no examination, no evaluation, only agreement. This automatic agreement is what allows patterns to remain hidden, because the mind does not need to prove the thought. It only needs to present it. And once it is accepted, the process moves forward. But when you begin to slow this process down, something changes. You begin to notice the gap, a small moment between the thought appearing and your response to it. At first, this moment is difficult to recognize. It happens quickly, almost too quickly to catch, but with awareness, it becomes more visible. And once you see it, you realize something important. You are not required to accept every thought immediately. You can pause, you can observe, you can question. This changes the entire dynamic of thinking. Because the thought is no longer in control of the outcome, you are. Instead of reacting, you are responding. Instead of following, you are deciding. And this decision point is where patterns begin to break. Because the pattern depends on speed. It depends on automatic acceptance. It depends on the absence of awareness. When you introduce awareness, the process slows down. And in that slower process, you begin to see more clearly. You begin to recognize familiar thoughts as they appear. You begin to identify patterns in real time. And once you identify them, you have a choice: to follow the pattern or to interrupt it. This interruption may feel small, but it is significant, because every interruption weakens the pattern, and every conscious decision strengthens your control. Over time, this creates a new way of thinking, one where thoughts are no longer commands, but options, and not every option needs to be chosen. As this awareness continues to develop, you begin to notice that patterns are not only present in your thoughts, but in your expectations. You start to anticipate certain outcomes before they happen. You expect things to go a certain way. You assume results before action is even taken, and these expectations influence how you behave. If you expect something to fail, you approach it differently. If you expect difficulty, you prepare for resistance. If you expect limitation, you move cautiously. These expectations are not always conscious. They often operate beneath awareness, but they shape everything. They determine how much effort you give, how long you persist, how quickly you give up. And because they are tied to repeated thoughts, they feel justified. They feel like reasonable conclusions. But when you begin to examine them, you realize they are often based on past patterns, not present reality. They are projections, carried forward from previous experiences. And when these projections go unchallenged, they continue to shape outcomes. A person who expects limitation often creates it, not intentionally, but through behavior, through hesitation, through reduced effort, through early withdrawal. This is how patterns reinforce themselves. The thought creates the expectation. The expectation shapes the action. The action produces a result, and that result confirms the thought. The cycle repeats, again and again, until it feels permanent. But it is not permanent. It is practiced. And anything practiced can be changed. But it requires awareness. You must begin to see the expectation as it forms, to recognize that it is not necessarily true, to question whether it deserves to guide your action. And when you do this, something shifts. You begin to act differently. You begin to test new outcomes. You begin to create experiences that do not align with the old pattern. And these new experiences begin to weaken the expectation. They introduce something new, possibility. And once possibility enters, the pattern no longer feels absolute. It begins to loosen. It begins to change. And with that change, your thinking begins to expand. As patterns begin to loosen, a new level of awareness starts to take shape. You begin to see how often your thinking follows the same direction, not just in moments of challenge, but in everyday situations. Small decisions, simple reactions, quiet assumptions. They all follow a familiar path. And once you see that path, it becomes difficult to ignore. You begin to recognize that much of what you experience is not new. It is repeated. Different situations, different people, but similar responses. This realization can be surprising because it challenges the idea that each moment is completely unique. Instead, it reveals that many moments are filtered through the same mental structure, the same pattern, and that pattern determines how the moment is experienced. This is why change does not always come from changing circumstances. A person can enter a new situation and still experience the same result, because they are bringing the same pattern with them, the same way of thinking, the same expectations, the same interpretations. And until that pattern changes, the outcome often remains similar. This is where awareness becomes transformative, because it allows you to see the pattern before it fully unfolds. You begin to recognize the direction your thinking is taking, and in that recognition, you gain the ability to redirect it, not by forcing a different thought, but by choosing not to follow the old one. This creates a shift, a subtle change in direction, and that change begins to influence everything that follows. A different action, a different response, a different result, and that different result introduces something new. Evidence. Evidence that the pattern is not fixed, that it can be changed, that you are not limited to repeating the same experience. This evidence builds over time, with each new response, with each new outcome, and gradually it begins to reshape how you see yourself, not as someone bound by patterns, but as someone capable of changing them. And this shift in identity is where real change begins. As this process continues, your relationship with your own thinking begins to change. You no longer see thoughts as something to follow automatically. You begin to see them as something to work with, something to understand, something to guide. This creates a sense of control that is different from what most people expect. It is not control through force. It is control through awareness, through choice, through consistency. You are not trying to eliminate thoughts. You are learning how to respond to them differently, and that difference changes everything. Because once you stop automatically following the same patterns, you stop creating the same outcomes. You begin to experience something new, not because the world has changed, but because your process has changed. And that process determines your direction. This is the foundation of self-mastery, not the absence of thought, but the ability to choose which thoughts will guide your actions. And as you continue to make these choices, something becomes clear. The pattern beneath your thinking is no longer hidden. It is visible. It is understood. And because it is understood, it can be changed. One decision at a time. One moment of awareness at a time, until the pattern itself begins to shift. And when that shift happens, everything that follows begins to change with it. As you begin to understand this more clearly, something else becomes evident. The pattern beneath your thinking does not only influence what you believe, it influences what you notice. Out of everything happening around you, your mind selects what aligns with its existing pattern. It highlights certain details, it ignores others, and in doing so, it creates a version of reality that feels complete. But it is not complete. It is filtered. A person who expects problems will notice what is wrong. A person who expects limitation will notice obstacles. A person who expects failure will notice signs that confirm it. This does not happen intentionally. It happens automatically, because the mind is constantly looking for consistency. It wants what you experience to match what you believe, and when it finds something that fits the pattern, it gives it more attention. It strengthens it. It reinforces it. This is why patterns can feel so convincing, because they are constantly being confirmed. But the confirmation is selective. It is not the full picture. It is a filtered version. And once you realize this, something shifts. You begin to question not only your thoughts, but what you are noticing. You begin to ask whether you are seeing everything, or only what your pattern allows you to see. This question creates awareness, and awareness expands perception. You begin to notice things that were previously overlooked, opportunities, alternatives, different interpretations. And as your perception expands, your thinking begins to change, because the pattern no longer controls what is seen. It no longer limits what is possible. And in that expansion, new directions begin to appear, directions that were always there, but were not previously visible. This is how awareness begins to reshape experience, not by changing the world, but by changing what you are able to see within it. If you bring all of this together, a clear understanding begins to form. Your thoughts are not random. They follow patterns. These patterns influence what you believe, what you expect, what you notice, and how you act. And over time, they shape the life you experience. But these patterns are not permanent. They are learned. They are practiced. And because they are practiced, they can be changed. This change does not happen all at once. It happens in moments. Moments where you pause instead of react. Moments where you question instead of accept. Moments where you choose differently than you have before. Each of these moments may seem small, but they are not. They are the points where patterns begin to shift. And as these moments accumulate, the shift becomes stronger, more consistent, more natural, until eventually the new pattern begins to replace the old one. And when that happens, your experience begins to change. Not because circumstances are different, but because your response to them is different. You are no longer following the same path automatically. You are choosing your direction, and that choice creates a different outcome. So as you move forward, remember this. The pattern beneath your thinking is always present. It is influencing you, whether you see it or not. But once you begin to see it, you are no longer bound by it. You are able to work with it, to question it, to change it. And through that process, you begin to create something new. A new way of thinking, a new way of responding, a new way of moving through your life. One that is no longer defined by repetition, but by awareness and choice. And that is where real change begins. There is one final realization that brings all of this into focus. The pattern beneath your thinking does not change because you understand it once. It changes because you see it repeatedly. Understanding creates awareness, but repetition creates transformation. Each time you notice the pattern, you weaken it. Each time you question a familiar thought, you interrupt it. Each time you choose a different response, you begin to replace it. This process is not dramatic. It is subtle. It happens in small moments, moments that often feel insignificant. But those moments are where the pattern exists, and those moments are where it must be changed. Most people are waiting for a major breakthrough, a single moment that changes everything. But real change does not happen that way. It happens through consistency, through awareness applied again and again, through small decisions that slowly shift direction. And over time, those small decisions accumulate. They begin to reshape how you think, how you respond, how you act, until eventually, the pattern that once felt automatic no longer feels natural. It begins to fade, and something new takes its place. A pattern built on awareness, on choice, on deliberate direction. This is where control becomes real. Not because you control every thought, but because you are no longer controlled by every thought. You have created space, and within that space, you have created the ability to choose. And that ability changes everything. Because once you begin to choose consistently, your direction becomes intentional. And when your direction is intentional, your outcomes begin to change. Not instantly, but steadily, in a way that continues to build over time. So, as you move forward, remember this. You are not trying to eliminate patterns. You are learning to recognize them, to question them, to reshape them. And through that process, you begin to take control of what once felt automatic. One moment at a time, one decision at a time, until the pattern itself begins to reflect the life you are choosing to create.